For centuries, people viewed elephants as living laborers, powerful but mindless giants created only to carry logs, fight in wars, and entertain crowds in circuses. For thousands of years, elephants quietly carried burdens and people on their backs, and we never bothered to look them in the eye and ask the simple question, what if, behind this calm exterior, there is a mind equal to ours? It wasn't until something happened that forever changed our view of these amazing creatures. Kenya, 1982. Amboseli National Park. Early morning. The air is still cool from the night, but the sun is already beginning to scorch the red African earth. Young American scientist Joyce Poole sat in her battered Jeep, which looked more like scrap metal on wheels than a vehicle. The door hung on one hinge, the windshield covered with a web of cracks, and the seat eaten away by countless African insects. In her pocket was a letter from the university, notification of a grant cut. There was enough money for just 3 more months of work, after which she would have to abandon her research and return home empty-handed. Joyce was recording the behavior of elephants for her dissertation, fighting off doubts and fatigue. At that time, elephants were considered no more than smart cows, animals capable of following commands but lacking complex thinking or emotions. Her supervisor, Professor Coleman, frequently reminded her in letters, "Miss Poole, don't attribute human qualities to animals. Study behavior, not imagine feelings. Science is about facts, not sentimental fantasies." And then she heard it, a low, barely perceptible hum that seemed to come not from the air, but directly from the earth. The sound was so deep, only 12 hertz, while the human ear can detect frequencies from 20 hertz, that she felt it more in her body than heard it. It was like a quiet earthquake, the rumble of a distant storm front, the very breath of the earth. Infrasound, a sound that can travel through solid rock for tens of miles. Joyce looked up from her notebook and saw him. A massive elephant stood 50 yards away, motionless, like an ancient statue of black granite. Even among his kind, he stood out for his size, around 13 feet at the shoulder, clearly an old male weighing nearly 6 tons. His left ear was half torn off, a clean cut, a mark of a trap or spear. On his right flank, a fresh wound from a sharp blade still oozed blood. His tusks bore scars from the past, one broken at the base as if chopped off with an axe, the other worn by time, covered with deep scratches from countless ropes. True battle scars of the war between man and nature, written on living flesh. But the most astonishing thing was in his eyes, small compared to his giant body, but incredibly expressive. The eyes stared directly at her. Not the fleeting glance of an animal noticing a human presence, not the wariness of a wild creature ready to flee or attack. This was a look of study, of evaluation, the gaze of a creature that thinks, that is trying to understand who stands before it and whether it can trust this strange 2-legged creature in a metal box. Joyce felt chills run down her spine. She had studied animal behavior for 5 years, observing lions in the Serengeti, chimpanzees in Uganda's forests, but she had never experienced anything like this. This was not the observation of a research object. This was a meeting, a contact between 2 intelligent beings trying to understand each other across the vast divide of species differences. The elephant slowly took a step forward. His walk was surprisingly graceful for such a giant, each movement calculated and precise. The ground beneath his feet didn't even tremble, though each foot was the size of a car tire. The pads of his feet worked like perfect shock absorbers, distributing the weight so skillfully that the 6-ton giant could walk almost silently. He came a few more steps closer and stopped. He raised his trunk and sniffed the air. Then he made a sound, not the trumpet call that elephants usually use to announce their presence, but something quiet, almost intimate, the sound of a question. Joyce held her breath. Her instinct told her to start the engine and leave. Lone old male elephants could be unpredictable, especially the wounded and angry ones who had faced brutal poachers. But something kept her in place. Perhaps it was scientific curiosity, or maybe it was intuition, telling her that this moment would change not only her life, but also all of humanity's understanding of the intelligence of land giants. The elephant stood and simply stared. Joyce sat and stared back. Time seemed to freeze in a fragile balance between human and animal, between civilization and the wild, between science and mystery. Somewhere deep in the savannah, baboons were screaming, vultures circled high in the sky, but in this small space between the jeep and the elephant, there was an incredible silence, a silence of understanding. Then the elephant did something remarkable. He sat down, just lowered himself to the ground, like domestic dogs do when they want to show they pose no threat. The giant sat in the middle of the savannah and continued to watch her with an expression of almost human curiosity. In the animal world, this behavior is called the playbow, a signal of peaceful intentions. But Joyce didn't know this yet. She simply saw that the giant predator had voluntarily made himself vulnerable, showing trust. In that moment, Joyce understood. Before her stood not just a representative of African savanna fauna. This was a personality, an individual with his own history, character, thoughts, and feelings. A being who had decided to trust her, despite all the wounds inflicted by humans. She named him Tembo, which means simply elephant in Swahili. A simple name for an extraordinary creature. At that time, she had no idea that this wounded giant would become the key to one of the most amazing secrets of our planet, the secret of animal intelligence. That day, Tembo sat next to the jeep for over 3 hours. He didn't get closer, didn't try to leave. He simply was. Sometimes he lay on his side, exposing his belly to the morning sun like a cat on a windowsill. Sometimes he got up and slowly circled the vehicle, examining it from different angles, tilting his head left and right, a gesture people make when trying to understand something new and interesting. He even carefully touched the rear bumper with his trunk, not pushing, not trying to flip it, but simply touching, exploring. The tip of his trunk worked like the fingers of a blind person reading Braille. He felt the metal, the rubber of the tires, even gently touch the antenna. This wasn't a chaotic investigation. It was a methodical study of an unfamiliar object. Joyce recorded every movement, every sound, every expression in his eyes. By the end of the day, she had accumulated 30 pages of notes, more than in the entire previous week of observations. But the most important discovery couldn't be written in numbers or facts. It was a revolution in understanding. Tembo clearly showed her that an elephant is not a biological machine responding to stimuli according to evolutionary programs, but a thinking being with a rich inner life. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in orange and purple tones, Tembo got up. He looked at Joyce one last time, long and carefully, as if memorizing her face. Then he made the same quiet sound as in the morning, turned, and slowly walked toward the acacia trees. At the edge of the grove, he stopped, turned around, and seemed to wave his trunk. Joyce could have sworn it was a farewell. Until tomorrow. And indeed, the next day Tembo came again, and the day after that. Over the next few months, he became a regular companion to her research. Sometimes he came alone, sometimes with other elephants. A small group of bachelors, as adult males who have left the herd are called. But even in a group, Tembo stood out. The other elephants treated him with obvious respect, yielding their place at the waterhole, not arguing when he picked the best acacia branches to eat. Joyce began to realize she was witnessing the elephant hierarchy, more complex than official science had thought. Tembo wasn't just an old male. He was a leader, a patriarch, an elephant whose authority was unquestioningly recognized by his peers. His scars were medals, testimonies to countless battles and victories. His calm confidence spoke of a deep understanding of the world he lived in. But when Joyce started publishing her first reports on Tembo's behavior, the scientific community met them with barely concealed skepticism. Weekly video calls with the university became intense interrogations. "Miss Poole," said Professor Coleman, his voice distorted by the poor satellite connection, "you are systematically attributing human motives and emotions to the elephant. This is a classic mistake made by novice researchers. Anthropomorphism. Science requires objectivity, not romantic fantasies about friendships with animals." "But Professor," Joyce objected, "you should have seen how he makes decisions, how he plans his actions, how he reacts differently to different people." "I've seen the behavior of thousands of animals in my career," Coleman interrupted. And they all demonstrate one thing: evolutionarily programmed responses to external stimuli. Elephants don't have a developed prefrontal cortex necessary for abstract thinking. They don't have mirror neurons that are responsible for empathy. These are scientifically established facts, not open for discussion. Animals don't think, they react. Colleagues at the university began openly questioning Joyce's competence. At an animal behavior conference, her report on the social hierarchy and individual traits of elephants was met with laughter. Next report, elephants reading Shakespeare? One of the professors quipped. Her research funding was further reduced. The grant was slashed to a minimum. Focus on male reproductive behavior, the university wrote to her. Study breeding cycles, territorial conflicts, topics of practical value for zoos and captive breeding programs. Your observations of supposed individual traits fall outside the realm of serious zoology. Joyce found herself in a desperate situation. Money was running out faster than expected. Life in the savannah was expensive. Fuel for constant trips, food she had to buy in the nearest town, 100 miles away, wages for local assistants and translators. Her colleagues back home increasingly hinted that her work was just the whim of a rich American woman playing at being a researcher. Her family was openly urging her to return home. Joyce, dear, her mother wrote, you're already 27. All your friends are married and raising children. It's time to leave these childish games with animals and get back to real life. Mr. Harrison, the son of our neighbors, just got divorced and is interested in you. He's a successful lawyer with a house in a nice neighborhood. Joyce seriously considered packing up and returning to America. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had seen something that wasn't there, attributing human qualities to the animals out of loneliness and desperation. Maybe Tembo was just a curious elephant, and she was simply a lonely woman who had found in him a substitute for human interaction. And then something happened that almost made her give up everything, but ultimately strengthened her resolve and forever changed her understanding of elephants. On March 15, 1984, at around 5 in the morning, Joyce woke to the sound of machine gun fire coming from about a mile away from her camp. Poachers. In recent years, they had turned into a real death squad for Africa's wildlife. The price of ivory on the international black market had skyrocketed tenfold over the past decade, turning elephant hunting from a traditional activity of local tribes into a high-tech business for international criminal syndicates. Modern poachers were armed with Kalashnikovs, weaponry that was abundantly supplied by various sides of the numerous African conflicts. They moved in jeeps, used radios to coordinate, and had connections with corrupt officials. These were not poor farmers killing elephants for food. They were professional wildlife killers. The shooting continued for about half an hour, short bursts of fire interspersed with screams and the sounds of fleeing animals. Joyce lay in her tent, clenching her fists in helplessness. She had no weapons, no radio to call for help. The nearest ranger station was 12 miles away. By the time they arrived, it would all be over. Then a sinister silence fell. Joyce knew what that meant. Somewhere, elephants had died. Perhaps the very ones she had been studying for a year and a half. Perhaps Tembo. 2 hours later, when the shooting finally stopped and the poacher's engines faded into the distance, Joyce shakily got into her battered Jeep and drove to the scene of the tragedy. Her heart was beating so hard that she could hear it over the roar of the engine. What if Tembo was dead? What if she would never see those wise, understanding eyes again? What she saw in the small clearing, where just yesterday the family of elephants she knew had peacefully grazed, shocked her to the core and forever changed her view of these creatures. In the middle of the clearing lay bodies, 4 adult elephants and 1 calf. The poachers had worked with brutal efficiency, cutting off the tusks, severing the trunks to sell on the Asian market for traditional medicine, and then disappearing, leaving the mutilated bodies to attract swarms of flies and vultures. The air was thick with the smell of blood and the beginnings of decay. But Tembo was alive, and what he was doing completely shattered all scientific notions of animal behavior in stressful situations. The surviving members of the family, Tembo and 5 other adult elephants, had not fled, as one would expect from traumatized animals facing the threat of death. They stayed, and their behavior didn't fit any theories about biological responses to stress. Tembo stood over the body of a young female elephant. Judging by her age, it could have been his daughter or niece. The poachers had turned her beautiful face into a bloody mask, cutting off her tusks at the base. But Tembo seemed to see not the mutilated corpse, but who this elephant had been when she was alive. He carefully touched her with his trunk, first the forehead, then the ears, and then the place where the tusks had once grown. His movements were gentle, reverent, full of love, like a person stroking the face of a deceased relative, trying to remember every detail. Tembo made sounds that Joyce had never heard before. These weren't cries of pain or anger that could be explained by stress and adrenaline. They were long, melodic sounds, resembling crying, human crying, sounds of grief, loss, and inconsolable sorrow. Then something even more astonishing happened. Tembo raised his trunk to the sky and began scattering dust over the body of the dead female elephant. But he didn't do it randomly, as elephants usually do when bathing or defending themselves from insects. He was acting with a purpose, first sprinkling the head, then the body, then creating a circle around the dead elephant. It was as if he were performing a ritual, a funeral ritual. The other elephants silently stood around, forming a wide circle. Their heads were lowered, their trunks hung still. Even the calves, who usually couldn't stay still for a minute, stood quietly, pressed against their mother's legs as if instinctively understanding the importance of the moment. In their posture, in their eyes, in the very atmosphere, there was something mournful, deeply human. This was not just a group of animals reacting to stress. This was a family saying goodbye to a deceased relative. Then the matriarch of the herd approached the body, the elephant Joyce had named grandmother. She was about 50 years old, an advanced age for a wild elephant. Her skin hung in deep folds, her tusks worn almost to the base from constant use, her movements slow and cautious. But in the herd, her authority was unquestionable. She made all the important decisions: when to go to the watering hole, where to find food, how to respond to danger. Grandmother stood next to the dead female elephant for a long time. Perhaps it was her own daughter or granddaughter. Elephant families maintain their kinship ties for decades. Then she too began to scatter dust, repeating the ritual that Tembo had started. After her, the rest of the family did the same. Each elephant approached the body, stood next to it for a long time, touched it with their trunk, and then participated in the dust-spreading ceremony. Even the calves tried to imitate the adults, clumsily lifting their trunks and scattering sand over the dead relative. This wasn't an instinctive response to the smell of death. This was a complex, structured ritual that required understanding of symbolism, the ability for abstract thought, a sense of community and tradition. The entire sad ceremony lasted for more than an hour. Joyce sat in the jeep, not daring to move, afraid of disturbing this sacred procedure. Tears flowed down her face, but she didn't even notice them. She understood that she was witnessing something exceptional, behavior that official science considered impossible for animals. After the ritual ended, the elephants slowly, one by one, approached the body and touched it with their trunks. This was the final farewell. Each touch lasted several seconds, as if they were trying to remember the smell, the texture of the skin, the last feeling of closeness with their forever departed relative. Some elephants made quiet sounds, not cries, but something resembling a whisper. Tembo stayed last. He stood over the dead female elephant for a long time after the others had moved away. His massive head was lowered so low it almost touched the ground. From time to time, he made quiet sounds, not crying, but something even deeper. Sounds for which there are no words in human language. Then he lifted his head and made a sound Joyce had never heard before. A deep, prolonged wail, full of inexpressible sorrow. The sound echoed across the savannah, and somewhere in the distance, many miles away, other elephants answered him. It was as if the entire elephant world knew about the tragedy and was expressing its condolences. "They mourn," Joyce whispered, and tears flowed down her face even more. "My God, they mourn just like we do. They have farewell rituals. They understand death. They love. They remember, and they suffer from loss." In that moment, she realized that her mission was not just to study the reproductive behavior of elephants for the benefit of zoos. Her mission was to prove to the world that these creatures possess intelligence, emotions, and souls, and that they deserve our respect and protection not as natural resources or tourist attractions, but as our true brothers in intellect. In the following days, Joyce continued to observe the behavior of the surviving elephants. What she saw completely convinced her that she was dealing not with mere animals, but with beings who possess a complex emotional life and cultural traditions. The elephant family periodically returned to the place where their relatives had died. They came alone or in groups, standing by the remains for long periods, touching them with their trunks. Some brought branches and leaves, carefully laying them nearby, just as people place flowers on the graves of loved ones. Tembo came every day for an entire week. Each visit lasted about an hour and was accompanied by the same quiet sounds of sadness. He stood next to the remains, sometimes touching them with his trunk, sometimes just silently lowering his head. One day, Joyce witnessed a remarkable scene. Another elephant, a large male from a neighboring territory who wasn't related to the deceased, arrived at the tragedy site. He sniffed the remains for a long time and then also began to scatter dust. It was as if he was expressing sympathy for the grief of others. This behavior completely contradicted all scientific ideas about animals as beings guided solely by instincts of survival and reproduction. What Joyce was observing was much more complex. Culture, traditions, emotional connections extending beyond mere kinship. These observations became a turning point in Joyce's work. She realized that she was studying not behavioral reactions, but a true civilization. Elephants had traditions passed down from generation to generation. They had concepts of life and death, family and duty, right and wrong. This was ancient wisdom accumulated over millions of years of evolution. But to prove this to the scientific community, undeniable evidence was needed. And Tembo again became the key to new discoveries. The first major breakthrough came completely unexpectedly. Joyce noticed a strange behavior in Tembo that she couldn't initially explain. Sometimes in the middle of an ordinary day, he would suddenly freeze in the middle of the savannah. He would raise one front leg, like a dog scenting prey. But he wasn't sniffing or listening to sounds in the air. It was as if he was listening to something coming from the earth beneath him. And after a few minutes, as if receiving some signal, he would head off in a particular direction. And he didn't walk aimlessly. His path was purposeful, as if he knew exactly where to go. And there, several miles away, other elephants would meet him. How did he find them? How did he know where they were? This question troubled Joyce for several months. She tried to find an explanation in behavioral literature, but found nothing suitable. All sources said that elephants navigated using sight, smell, and familiar paths. But Tembo was clearly using some other form of communication. The solution came by chance. Joyce was reading an article about whale songs and came across the name of Dr. Katie Payne, a bioacoustic biologist who studied low-frequency communication in marine mammals. The article mentioned that whales used infrasound, sound waves below the threshold of human perception, to communicate over long distances. An insane idea struck Joyce. What if elephants also used infrasound? What if that strange hum she sometimes felt with her whole body near Tembo was not a coincidence, but a method of communication? She wrote a letter to Dr. Payne describing her observations. To her surprise, Katie replied almost immediately and expressed her willingness to come to Kenya for joint research. "Your observations align with my suspicions," she wrote. "I've long suspected that large land mammals must use infrasound for communication, but no one has tested this hypothesis." 3 months later, Katie Payne arrived in Amboseli with an entire array of acoustic equipment, special microphones capable of capturing sounds at frequencies as low as 1 hertz, digital spectrum analyzers, computers for data processing. The equipment cost more than the entire budget for Joyce's research over 2 years. And on the very first day of their work, they made a discovery that shook the scientific world. Elephants were indeed talking, at frequencies between 5 and 20 hertz, below the threshold of human hearing. Their voices traveled through the earth for tens of miles like seismic waves from an earthquake. They had a real language, a complex, multifaceted, ancient one. Tembo didn't just make sounds at that strange moment of stillness. He was transmitting and receiving messages. "I'm here, at the waterhole by the large rocks. Come here, there's plenty of good grass. Danger from the east, armed people. I've found water in the dry riverbed." And other elephants understood him and responded. Computer analysis showed that each elephant had a unique signature, a set of frequency characteristics that allowed other elephants to identify who was sending the message. It was similar to a call sign system in radio communication. Moreover, different types of messages had different structures. Calls for help were short and repetitive. Messages about food were longer and more melodic. Warnings of danger were sharp and abrupt. "This is not just sound," Dr. Katie Payne wrote in her report. "This is a language. Syntax, semantics, grammar, it's all there." Elephants possess a communication system comparable in complexity to primate languages. But this was only the beginning of the discoveries that came with the careful study of Tembo's behavior. The next breakthrough occurred during an experiment that Joyce decided to conduct, inspired by an article she had read on self-awareness in primates. She set up a huge mirror near the watering hole, a specially ordered large steel mirror, sturdy enough to withstand the elephant's curiosity. Most animals, upon seeing their reflection, either ignore it or perceive it as another animal and try to attack or run away. The ability to recognize oneself in a mirror is a sign of advanced self-awareness, a trait previously found only in humans, great apes, and dolphins. Tembo reacted to the mirror in a completely unique way. At first, he stood before it for a long time, examining his reflection. Then he began experimenting, moving his trunk and watching how the reflection moved. He raised a leg, and the reflection raised a leg. He turned his head, and the reflection turned its head. This went on for about half an hour. Tembo was clearly trying to understand the connection between his movements and what was happening in the mirror. And then something astonishing happened. Tembo raised his trunk and touched his injured ear, the very spot that could only be seen in the reflection. He couldn't see that spot without the mirror, but somehow he understood that the creature in the mirror was himself. He recognized himself. He understood that he was looking at his own reflection, not another elephant. Self-awareness, Joyce wrote in her journal. Tembo doesn't just know that he exists. He knows who he is. He has a concept of I separate from the concept of not I. This is one of the highest manifestations of intelligence. But that wasn't all. In the following days, Tembo continued using the mirror, but in a different way. He used it as a tool. He examined parts of his body that he couldn't usually see. He checked the healing of his wounds. It even seemed like he was admiring himself, turning to the mirror from different sides. The news of this experiment spread quickly through the scientific community. Joyce was invited to conferences, and her articles began to be published in prestigious journals. But many colleagues still approached her work with skepticism. One elephant doesn't make a scientific theory, critics said. More evidence was needed, and Tembo continued to provide it. The next discoveries related to the emotional realm of elephants, and they were even more astonishing. Joyce began to notice that Tembo didn't just react to events. He exhibited complex emotions that had previously been considered exclusively human. One day she witnessed a scene that forever changed her understanding of elephant psychology. A young elephant from a neighboring family had fallen into a deep, muddy pit next to the dried-up riverbed. His mother trumpeted in panic, but she was too heavy to approach the edge of the pit without risking collapse. Tembo heard the cries and came to see what was happening. He studied the situation for a long time, walking around the pit, evaluating the depth and condition of the soil. Then he did something incredible. He approached the nearest tree and broke off a thick branch. Not randomly, not in a fit of rage, but very deliberately, choosing a branch of the right length and thickness. He then returned to the pit and began methodically pushing away the mud, creating a solid path to the young elephant. The work took more than an hour. Tembo acted like an engineer, calculating each movement. When the path was ready, he carefully descended into the pit and used his trunk to pull the frightened calf to the surface. Using tools, planning a multi-step operation, altruism toward a non-relative calf. All of this was demonstrated by an old African elephant, whom official science had still considered nothing more than a smart cow. But the most astonishing thing was the expression in Tembo's eyes during this operation. There was focus, determination, even something resembling satisfaction from a job well done. After rescuing the calf, he stood for a long time, watching the baby reunite with its mother. There was pride in his posture, pride in his deed. The calf's mother approached Tembo and touched his trunk for a long time, a gesture of gratitude in the elephant world. Tembo responded in kind. There was a silent dialogue between them, full of emotions that human language can hardly convey. This case became a turning point in Joyce's research. She realized that she was observing not just a highly intelligent animal, but an incredible being with moral principles. Tembo didn't save a non-relative calf because it would benefit his own survival or reproduction, but because he believed it was the right thing to do. After this event, Joyce began to purposefully study Tembo's problem-solving abilities. She developed a series of experiments that required not just strength or good memory, but real thinking. The most famous experiment involved obtaining inaccessible food. Joyce hung fruit high above the ground, out of reach of the trunk. She placed various objects nearby: wooden blocks, car tires, metal boxes. Most animals in such a situation either tried to jump repeatedly or quickly lost interest and left. Tembo behaved differently. At first, he tried to reach the fruit directly by standing on his hind legs. After realizing that it was impossible, he stopped and thought. Literally thought. He stood still, looking first at the fruit, then at the objects around him. His gaze finally settled on a large wooden block standing off to the side. And then something happened that scientists call an insight, a moment of realization. Something changed in Tembo's eyes. There was understanding. He walked over to the block, carefully rolled it under the hanging fruit, climbed onto it, and calmly reached the food. He didn't find the solution by trial and error. He thought it through. He analyzed the situation, compared the possibilities, and made a decision, like a person solving a puzzle. And when, the next day, Joyce removed the block and replaced it with a car tire, Tembo used it without hesitation. He understood the principle, that any stable object of suitable height could serve as a pedestal. This was abstract thinking of the highest level. Joyce's colleagues no longer laughed at her work. Video recordings of the experiments with Tembo caused a real sensation in the scientific world. Scientists began visiting Amboseli to see this extraordinary elephant for themselves, and he continued to surprise them with new displays of intelligence. It was discovered that Tembo could differentiate human languages and assess the level of threat by voice. When Joyce played recordings of the voices of the Maasai tribe members, who had traditionally hunted elephants, Tembo immediately adopted a defensive posture. He spread his ears, raised his trunk, preparing to flee or attack. But when the voices of the Kikuyu tribe, who peacefully coexisted with elephants and even revered them as sacred animals, played, Tembo remained calm. He continued eating, drinking, and behaved completely relaxed. Moreover, he could differentiate not only languages, but also intonations. The male voices of the Maasai caused him great distress. The female voices caused mild alertness, and the voices of children didn't disturb him at all. Tembo understood that the threat was only posed by adult male warriors, while women and children were safe. This discovery had enormous practical significance. It showed that elephants didn't just fear all humans equally, but were capable of fine threat differentiation. They analyze sounds, remember voice patterns, and make conclusions about people's intentions based on acoustic information. Tembo doesn't just hear sounds, Joyce wrote in her report. He analyzes them, recognizes patterns, makes predictions. This is higher-order cognitive activity requiring a developed cerebral cortex and the ability to think abstractly. But even more astonishing was the discovery of Tembo's artistic abilities. It happened almost by accident when Joyce, inspired by stories of drawing apes, decided to offer the elephant a paintbrush and colors. She didn't expect anything extraordinary. At best, some chaotic smearing of paint on the canvas. But Tembo behaved completely unexpectedly. He took the brush with the tip of his trunk and began creating patterns. Not random strokes, but deliberate compositions. His first painting was a series of concentric circles, simple but surprisingly harmonious. Then he began experimenting with colors, mixing yellow with red, blue with green. When Joyce played music, his movements became rhythmic, synchronized with the melody. Even more surprising was that Tembo seemed to enjoy the process of painting. He spent a long time studying his creations, sometimes returning to unfinished works to add new details. He had a sense of composition, an understanding of color combinations, and even something resembling an artistic style. Research showed that elephants are capable of distinguishing 12 notes in the musical scale and can remember simple melodies for up to a year and a half. Tembo responded to music not just as sounds. He felt the rhythm, harmony, and emotional tone of the melodies. When fast music played, he began to sway rhythmically, like a dancer. Slow, sad melodies made him freeze, lowering his head as if he were grieving with the music. Classical pieces elicited a special reaction from him. He froze in a pose of attentive listening, occasionally nodding his head in time with the music. Tembo has an aesthetic sense, Joyce wrote. He doesn't just perceive beauty, he is capable of creating it. This indicates the highest level of nervous system development, with the same brain structures responsible for creativity in humans. But the real revelation came with the understanding of how complex elephant communication is. Months of observation of Tembo and his family showed that elephants had something far more complicated than simple danger signals or calls for food. They have names. Each elephant in the herd has a unique vocal call sign that others use when addressing them. Joyce recorded how a mother elephant called a specific calf from among a group of playing youngsters, and only that calf responded to her call. It was not a general call like, "Children, come here," but a personal address like, "Jambo, come to mom." Computer analysis of sound showed that each elephant has a set of unique frequency characteristics, a kind of voice signature that kin can easily recognize even from several miles away. This allows them to maintain personal connections in large herds of dozens of individuals. Moreover, elephants use different tones of voice to express different emotions: joy, sadness, anxiety, curiosity. Each state has its own acoustic characteristics. Tembo could say the same message, such as "come here," in 10 different ways, each conveying additional information about urgency, emotional state, or degree of danger. They pass knowledge from generation to generation, creating true cultural traditions. Older female elephants teach younger ones where to find water during the dry season, how to avoid dangerous places, how to care for offspring, and how to behave around humans. This knowledge is not genetically programmed. It is acquired through learning and practice. Joyce observed how an experienced matriarch taught young female elephants how to properly use medicinal plants. Certain leaves were chewed for stomach upset, the bark of some trees helped with parasites, and roots of others were used to treat infections. This was real folk medicine, passed from teacher to student. And the most amazing part, elephants are capable of cooperation at a level comparable to higher primates. Joyce developed a special experiment. 2 elephants had to pull on opposite ends of a rope at the same time to obtain a treat. If only one pulled, the system wouldn't work. Joint efforts were required. Tembo and his partner quickly understood the rules of the game. Moreover, they demonstrated an understanding of the importance of synchronization. If the partner was delayed, Tembo patiently waited up to 45 seconds, not attempting to pull the rope alone. This showed an understanding of teamwork principles, the ability to suppress impulsive desires for the sake of a common goal. While such a task seems simple for humans, it can be difficult for most animals. When similar tests were done with crows and their relatives, who, as research increasingly shows, are exceptionally intelligent, they never wait for their partner. In the wild, Joyce observed even more complex examples of cooperation. Elephants could organize a rescue operation for a calf in distress, coordinate defense against predators, and solve problems related to finding water and food together. All of this required planning, role distribution, and mutual understanding, qualities once considered exclusively human. But the most astonishing display of Tembo's intellect came in a story that took place in 1989 and forever changed human perceptions of the moral qualities of elephants. That year, an unusually intense fire broke out in the savannah. The drought had lasted for several months. The vegetation had nearly dried up, and a small spark from lightning instantly turned into a fiery disaster. The flames spread with the wind's speed, consuming everything in their path. Joyce and her team were ordered to evacuate immediately. The fire was approaching their camp, and staying there was deadly dangerous. She gathered the most valuable equipment, loaded it into the Jeep, and prepared to leave. She glanced back at the savannah for one last time, expecting to see herds of animals fleeing the fire. But Tembo did not run away. Instead, he moved toward the fire. Joyce could not believe her eyes. The elephant was heading to the nearest watering hole, filling his trunk with as much water as possible, around 10 liters, and methodically pouring it onto the burning bushes. This was not a chaotic action of a frightened animal. It was a calculated strategy to fight the fire. Tembo chose the most critical spots, areas where the flames could spread to large trees or onto territory where other elephants were grazing. He worked like a professional firefighter. The water in his trunk ran out quickly, and Tembo returned again and again to the watering hole. The path between the water and the fire was several hundred yards, but he covered it at a run, despite the smoke and heat. The fire scorched the tip of his trunk, but he did not retreat. Joyce was stunned not only by the fact that the elephant was fighting the fire, but also by the understanding behind his actions. Tembo understood cause and effect. Water puts out fire, fire threatens the forest, and the forest is home to many living creatures, including elephants. He made a moral decision to risk his own safety in order to save his home. This incident led to an amazing discovery. After carefully studying similar cases around the world, it was found that in Indonesia, elephants had long been used to fight forest fires. They are specially trained to work with water pumps and hoses, and these firefighter elephants have shown incredible effectiveness in extinguishing fires in hard-to-reach areas. But Tembo had not been trained. He figured out what needed to be done on his own, and he made the decision to act. This was a manifestation of what philosophers call moral judgment, the ability to distinguish right from wrong and to act according to that understanding. After this incident, news of Tembo spread far beyond the scientific community. Newspapers wrote about him, documentaries were made, and he was featured in popular science programs. He became a symbol of the rationality of the animal world, living proof that intelligence and morality are not exclusively human traits. But the most famous discovery related to Tembo was still ahead, and this discovery would change people's perceptions of elephants forever. In 1995, Joyce received a grant to study elephant transportation, a topic that had become relevant due to the need to transport animals between zoos and reserves for breeding programs. When Tembo needed to be moved from one reserve to another, Joyce decided to conduct an unusual experiment. The problem with transporting elephants by plane was that these giants could panic in an enclosed space and begin thrashing around in the cage, disrupting the balance of the aircraft. This could even lead to a plane crash. Usually, elephants had to be put to sleep during the flight, but this was dangerous for their health. Joyce came up with an alternative solution based on an understanding of elephant psychology. She placed several dozen small chicks, yellow, fluffy, incredibly fragile creatures, inside Tembo's transport crate. The logic was simple. Through extensive research, Joyce was absolutely sure that elephants had a developed sense of empathy and an instinct to protect the vulnerable. If Tembo saw defenseless creatures nearby, he would behave extremely cautiously so as not to harm them. The result exceeded all expectations. Upon seeing the chicks, Tembo froze. This 5-ton giant, who could wipe everything out with a single swing of his trunk, stood motionless for the entire 8-hour flight from one reserve to another. The pilots reported that the flight was unusually smooth. Normally, transporting large animals involve vibration, shifts in the center of gravity, and balancing problems. But with Tembo, everything was different. Even when the plane entered a zone of heavy turbulence and the passengers were tossed from side to side, the elephant managed to maintain balance, making no reckless movements. The flight attendant, who peeked into the cargo hold, later told an incredible story. Tembo stood with his trunk raised, carefully watching each chick. When one of them got too close to his feet, the elephant gently nudged it to a safe place. When another chick squeaked in fear during the turbulence, Tembo bent down and quietly rumbled, soothing the little one. Compassion for defenseless creatures proved stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. The fear of flying, the stress of being in an enclosed space, and the physical discomfort All of this faded into the background in the face of the need to protect the tiny chicks. On that day, the entire crew of the plane realized they were not just transporting a huge animal, they were transporting an individual with a developed system of moral values, a being capable of self-sacrifice for others, suppressing its own needs for higher principles. The story of the chicks spread worldwide and became a turning point in the perception of elephants by the public. Video recordings of the experiment were shown on television in every country. Photographs of the huge elephant carefully standing among the tiny yellow chicks appeared on magazine covers and became a symbol of interspecies compassion. But the real global recognition for Tembo and Joyce's discoveries came after the events of December 26, 2004, the day when elephants saved thousands of lives from a terrible disaster. That fateful morning, the Indian Ocean coastline looked idyllic. Tourists from all over the world were enjoying the tropical paradise. Thailand, Sri Lanka, and India's white beaches seemed like the embodiment of serenity. 8-year-old British girl Amber Mason was riding an elephant named Ning Nong along the beach of a resort on Phuket Island. It was an ordinary day of vacation, sun, sea, exotic activities that would be remembered for a lifetime. But around 4 in the morning, something monstrous happened deep in the Indian Ocean. Off the coast of Sumatra, at a depth of 18 miles, tectonic plates shifted, triggering an underwater earthquake with a magnitude of 9.0, one of the most powerful in human history. The energy released in that moment was equivalent to the explosion of 23,000 atomic bombs. But the people on the beaches didn't know yet. The earthquake had occurred 1,200 miles away, underwater, and none of the vacationers felt it. They continued sunbathing, swimming in the clear water, and planning excursions for the day. However, the elephants knew. Along the entire coast, animals began behaving strangely long before the first waves reached the shore. In Thailand, in the Khao Lak area, elephant owner Yongkrit Kheosawan woke up at 4 in the morning to horrifying sounds. His 8 elephants were making cries he had never heard in 20 years of working with them. It sounded like crying, he later told journalists. Not the usual elephant trumpet calls, but something incredibly sad and disturbing, as if they were mourning a tragedy that hadn't yet occurred. The elephants tore apart the chains they were tied to at night. Metal links that could withstand a ton of weight broke like threads. The animals ran up the slope, making piercing warning calls. People who had lived near the elephants their whole lives and understood their behavior followed them. On Patong Beach, the elephant Ning Nong sensed disaster approaching with her entire being. She had been carrying tourists for half an hour but suddenly became uneasy, raising her trunk, sniffing at something invisible, shifting from foot to foot. Her handler Dan, who had worked with elephants for 10 years, had never seen Ning Nong in such a state. Little Amber, sitting on the elephant's back, felt the animal's tension. "Something's wrong," she said to her parents, who were watching from the shore. Then something strange happened. The sea suddenly retreated. The water pulled away from the shore by hundreds of yards, exposing the ocean floor, covered in fish, coral, and seaweed. Tourists were mesmerized by this unprecedented sight. Many ran to the waterline, unaware that this was a sign of the approaching catastrophe, but the elephant understood. Ning Nong turned around and quickly ran away from the sea, still carrying the little girl on her back, forcing the guide and the girl's family to run in the same direction. The animal wasn't just fleeing, it was saving lives. Minutes later, from a safe elevation, everyone watched in horror as a massive wave crashed onto the coast, sweeping everything in its path. How did the elephants know about the impending disaster? Michael Garstang, a scientist at the University of Virginia, believes that the elephants in Thailand reacted to the sound of waves crashing on the Sumatra coast from a long distance. At the same time, they heard the strange local sound of the retreating water along the coast about 20 minutes before the tsunami struck. They also sensed the strange smell of the exposed ocean floor. Studies in acoustic and seismic communication show that elephants could easily pick up vibrations generated by the massive earthquake and tsunami. Joyce Poole personally experienced this. "I was with elephants during 2 minor earthquakes, and in both cases, the elephants ran in alarm a few seconds before I felt the tremor." This is how Tembo warned us of the approaching natural disaster. By the late 1990s, Tembo had become the most studied elephant in the world. His story spread across the globe, changing people's perceptions of animal intelligence. Documentaries about him were shown on all continents. Children in schools studied his abilities. Scientists from around the world came to Amboseli to see the legendary elephant with their own eyes. But the years of poaching, droughts, and human interference had taken their toll. In 2003, when Tembo was around 45 years old, Joyce noticed he had become slower. His old wounds from past encounters with poachers ached during the cold nights. His vision had weakened, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. Even in his advanced age, Tembo continued to demonstrate remarkable intelligence. He invented new ways of using tools, learned how to open complex locks, and continued painting. Now his artwork became more abstract, as if reflecting the depth of the years he had lived. On the morning of February 18, 2006, Joyce found Tembo lying beneath his favorite acacia tree. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep, like a wise elder. He was about 48 years old, a respectable age for a wild elephant. But Tembo's death did not mark the end of his story. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's understanding of animal intelligence. The elephant family came to say goodbye to Tembo. They performed the same burial ritual that Joyce had first witnessed 24 years earlier. They sprinkled his body with dust. They touched him with their trunks. They stood in a silent mourning. Even elephants from neighboring territories came to pay their respects to the patriarch who had changed people's views of their species. By the time of Tembo's death, the world had already changed forever. Thanks to this incredible elephant and Joyce Poole's research, the scientific community recognized that elephants possess self-awareness. They recognize themselves in the mirror. Complex emotions, grief, joy, compassion, even a sense of justice. An advanced communication system, an infrasound language with grammar and syntax, the ability for abstract thinking, planning, problem-solving, and tool use, cultural traditions, knowledge passed down from generation to generation, moral principles, altruism, protection of the weak, a sense of duty. Elephants were no longer considered simply smart cows. They were recognized for what they always were, intelligent beings with a rich inner life, deserving of respect and protection. The research, which began with simple observations of an injured elephant in the Kenyan savannah, led to a revolution in zoology, animal psychology, and wildlife conservation. Joyce Poole's works are cited in thousands of scientific papers. Methods for studying elephant intelligence are now applied to other species. Thanks to Tembo, laws protecting elephants were changed worldwide. The ivory trade was banned in most countries. New reserves were created. Programs to mitigate human-elephant conflicts were built on an understanding of the psychology of these animals, not on coercion. But the most important change occurred in people's minds. What started as a young scientist's dissertation on the reproductive behavior of elephants turned into one of the greatest discoveries in the history of animal behavior science. Today, years after Tembo's death, his story continues to inspire new generations of researchers. A monument has been erected in Amboseli, a simple stone slab with an engraved image of an elephant and the inscription, "Tembo, teacher who showed us that intelligence has many forms." Joyce Poole, now in her 70s, continues to study elephants. She founded several organizations for the protection of these animals and has written numerous books on elephant intelligence. Her works have formed the foundation of modern elephant conservation programs around the world. In a small museum in Amboseli stands a bronze statue of Tembo. On the plaque are engraved the words of Joyce Poole. Tembo taught us that intelligence takes many forms. Intelligence and emotions are not exclusively human traits. They are different expressions of a single phenomenon of consciousness that connects all thinking beings on our planet. Next to it hangs a photograph, a young scientist in a battered jeep and a giant elephant standing peacefully beside her. Two intelligent beings who found each other across the chasm of species differences and changed the world. Tembo's story is one of the lessons that, if we are willing to listen, nature is ready to teach us. It's about the fact that wisdom knows no boundaries between species. It's about the fact that in this world we are not alone. Other forms of intelligence surround us, waiting for our recognition and respect. And somewhere in the African savanna, a new generation of elephants is passing down ancient knowledge to their calves, keeping the memory of the great Tembo, an elephant who proved to the world that animals have souls.